NAFTA, this is kind of the future of the local trading network. NAFTA is, of course, in good shape. We don't need Bretton Woods to hold that together, and the CAFTA states of Central America are already in the group. But three countries I want to point out are Colombia, Venezuela, and Cuba. Colombia and Venezuela, all of their population is Atlantic fronting, facing the Caribbean. And so their only option is really to integrate with the United States or die. The Colombians have buried their pride on this one, have already joined in. But just think of the distance involved. Bogota to Lima, which is the next major population center to the south, that's 1,200 miles. That's Fargo to Seattle or Fargo to Austin. And there's nothing in between, it's jungle mountain. Cuba's a little bit different. Cuba is positioned between the Yucatan Straits and the Florida Straits, which means that Cuba is the only country in the world that can potentially threaten U.S. internal distribution lines, because that connection through the intercoastal from the Gulf of Mexico to the Atlantic seaboard goes right by Cuba. That's not something the United States is going to tolerate. Cuba will not be able to continue existing as the independent power that it is right now. Now, whether or not they choose to join when Castro finally dies, whether that will happen in the next 15 years or not, I have no idea. Or whether or not the United States forces the issue is another point. But those three countries are going to be part of the American trade network. Mexico's fun. Mexico should be a failed state. Mexico has nothing going for it. It's all highland, desert, and jungle. These are the worst types of terrain that you can develop a successful economy and culture with. This is what their agricultural land is. The dark red, that is areas where you don't need irrigation. The orange is where you do. You'll notice that almost all of theirs is orange, and it's not in a big blob like ours is. It's scattered about, so every piece of infrastructure you build, you then have to rebuild. You can never get leverage. So it's always going to be capital poor. It's always going to have substandard infrastructure. Despite that, I still see this being the fastest growing economy for the next 30 years. 4 reasons. One, their labor costs are now cheaper than China's. Because of that demographic imbalance in China, labor costs have increased by a factor of 6 in the last 12 years. Mexico's have held fairly steady. 2, shale. We have tripled our exports of natural gas to Mexico in the last decade. And we're going to triple it again in the next 4 years, because there are 9 trunk lines under construction right now that'll be finished by 2017, which means the Americans will be providing power not just for the maquiladora industries on the border, but for downtown Mexico City itself. So from a manufacturing point of view, one of the biggest problems holding them back is about to disappear. 3rd is demography. It's a young population, lots of a workforce, big consumption base. And then finally, the drug war is perhaps the best thing that's ever happened to the country from an economic point of view. Now that requires some explanation. Mexico is successful as an industrial power because it's right next to the United States. People invest in Mexico to metabolize cheap Mexican labor. Now, the more expensive American labor is and the more expensive American labor is and the cheaper Mexican labor is, the bigger that differential, the more sense it makes. The drug war has pushed down labor costs in Mexico. FDI is at an all-time high, despite the fact that violence is at an all-time high. In fact, because violence is at an all-time high. Now, the Americans don't know what to do about this just yet, which is weird because this is now the 2nd largest bilateral economic relationship in human history, and by 2020, it's going to be the largest. In fact, the Mexican-American border is already the most crossed border in human history. That's not counting the illegals. It's not that the Americans need to decide whether or not we want to integrate with Mexico. It's that we've already decided we don't know what to do about it. And here's the problem we're facing. The blue are areas of Hispanic concentration. The fun thing about Mexico from a demographic point of view as regards the United States and immigration is that they are the only people in the world that can walk to the United States. So everywhere else in the world, you're going to have multiple ghettos of the various cultures that can physically transport themselves. Here, we only have Mexicans and Central Americans. So all of our ghetto populations are Hispanic. That gives us a bit of a complication when you look at this next slide. You guys all remember Miami Vice? Hookers and Blow, good family show. That was a great show because it showed how local law enforcement was struggling with the international phenomena that was the drug trade. Because all of the cocaine that came out of Venezuela that came to the United States came through Miami. That's what the map looked like. But you may remember that the Americans have these little things called aircraft carrier battle groups. And once we made a concerted effort to intercept maritime shipping that was smuggling, shooting down planes that were flying 10 feet over the water at night with no lights on, not a tourist thing, those are drug runners, you had this, and the routes split up. The drug runners did not want to fly or send their cargo vessels into the United States direct. They were afraid they'd be intercepted. So they started smuggling on container ships, but mostly going on land through Mexico. Because the Mexican border with the United States is 2,000 miles long. That's twice the length of the Cold War border. And if the United States were to decommission its entire military and put all of its troops on the border, that's only one dude every 50 feet. That's not the kind of thing that we can block. And so the cartel wars are about the cartels fighting over the transport routes through on-land Mexico to the United States, because it's something we can't staunch. The problem comes is when you mesh that demographic ghetto issue with the drug transport issue, because the cartels have done the same thing that Monsanto or UPS have done. They've diversified. They've gone up the supply chain into South America, where they've now contract directly with the coca producers. And now they're coming down the supply chain to the United States. And because we don't have an immigration policy to integrate these ghetto populations, we've provided the cartels with exactly what they need to spread very quickly in the United States. According to the Department of Justice, the cartels are now the dominant organized crime group in 1,000 American municipalities, everything from LA to Boston. And they are kicking the gang's asses. And in a few years, no more than 10, probably closer to 5, the Crips and the Bloods and groups like them just won't exist anymore because the cartels will have killed them all. And they'll take over retail drug distribution. That would be bad enough as it is. But remember that the cartel wars are about the cartels fighting over the distribution networks, the transport networks. The real money is in the United States. Expect the cartel wars to spill north of the border as the cartels go after each other in the United States. That's the biggest threat I see to America in the next 60 years. By far, number one, probably bigger than everything else put together. All right, we're going to fly through Brazil and Southeast Asia, and then we'll break for questions.